I specialize in domestic battery cases, and hindsight being 2020, from the stories that she was telling me, it was clear that she was a battered woman.
Welcome to the podcast, Chalice Paul, Disappeared, the True Story. Today we have a special guest. His name is Joe Arbie. Joe Arbie used to be first sergeant with the Key West Police Department back in the 1980s, going in the 1990s. And he's now retired. He lives in North Florida. And he's had the pleasure of meeting Chalice when he first started the force in Key West Police Department. Joe, thank you for attending today in our interview.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, Joe, I want to start off with kind of a timeline, because, you know, law enforcement is all about timeline. And we pinpoint that you met Chalice probably in the earlier part, January of 1981, possibly February 1981, because it was cold in Key West. So I'm going to let you go ahead and explain when and how you first met Chalice.
Okay, it was a day or two after Christmas of 1980 when I first met Chalice. I had responded to a call to the Howard Johnson's Motel, and it was billed as a dispute. And when I arrived, Chalice Paul, using the name Barnett, had checked into the hotel and had already been there 2 or 3 days. The American Express card that she was using was canceled. So she had approached the clerk and asked to stay another day, and they ran her credit card and it was denied. And the Howard Johnson's called the police department to have her escorted off the property. Now, I arrived, there was no dispute or argument or anything of that nature that was going on. She willingly understood that without payment she couldn't remain there any longer, and she voluntarily gathered her property together that she had in her hotel room and checked out of the motel. And that was probably around sunset. I remember it being around dusk. So that would have been between 7:30 and 8 o'clock p.m. in December in Key West.
So in December, it might have been a little bit earlier, only because they had daylight savings then, didn't they? Because December is usually the shortest month of the year.
Yeah, it would. Daylight savings times, I believe, changes in sometime in November. Goes from daylight savings to standard time.
So I was mistaken. It was right after Christmas. Well, that's, you know, a few weeks before going into New Year's. So did she get all the first 3 days paid by the credit card and just wanted to add on an extra day, or was it the full stay there was not covered under the credit card?
No, I think I don't think she had any definite plans at the time. And she had initially booked for 3 days, and the credit card was accepted for that amount. And then she was going to re-register and stay a couple more days. And then that's when she discovered that the credit card had been canceled or declined.
And why was it canceled? Because it was maxed out, or was there another reason why?
Well, it was under the name of John Paul, and apparently John Paul had canceled the card.
Oh, okay. So the actual credit card she had in her possession had his name on it.
That's correct.
Okay, so he didn't report it stolen. He knew.
No, he did not.
Okay.
If he had reported the card stolen, I would have been in a different situation. It would have gone from a civil problem to a criminal problem, but the card was not reported stolen.
So he just didn't want her to stay. Did she explain why she was in Key West on that trip?
At that point, she didn't. Later on, I found out a little bit more detail. But at that point, I was just in a civil capacity standing by until she vacated the property.
And then when was the next time you met her after she departed?
It was actually the same evening. I went off duty at 11 o'clock that day. And by habit, I would always go to the International House of Pancakes, which was just a half a mile from the Howard Johnson's motel. It wasn't far. And I went into the restaurant to have my early morning breakfast after getting off duty. And she was sitting there and alone and said hi to me, and we struck up a conversation.
And was she going to leave that night, or was she planning on staying in the diner all night if she didn't have the funds to stay in a hotel room?
It wasn't real clear what her plans were. She told me that she was in a difficult situation. She explained to me that she was separated from her husband and that he had just canceled the card and that she basically had no funds to proceed anywhere. But she told me that she was having some money wired to her through Western Union, but I wasn't clear on where the source of that money was coming from. So she had nowhere to go. I had an extra room in my residence on Stock Island, so I invited her to stay with me until she could get the funds to continue on her journey.
So she stayed just one night, or did she stay a little bit longer?
She was with me between a week and 10 days that she stayed with me at my residence in Stock Island. She was driving a practically a brand new Audi 4000. I remember the car very well because it was an absolutely beautiful car, and Audis had always impressed me. I'm kind of a car guy. So, and it had Georgia plates on that. I distinctly remember that.
Yeah, didn't you do a check on the car to make sure that the car wasn't stolen?
I did, and the reason I did that is I had an old beater of a 76 Pontiac Astra, and she preferred to drive the Astra around when I was on duty than to drive her own car. And I thought that was a little bit odd. So I ran a check on the car, and of course it wasn't reported stolen, and there wasn't anything outstanding as far as the registration check. I distinctly recall it came back registered to John Paul.
That was a dark blue Audi?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that car.
It was a beautiful car, yes.
Yes. She actually had it up in Palm Beach, and then she drove it back to Atlanta before she disappeared. So she got her wire, but she decided to stay, or did it take a while for the wire to come?
The best of my memory, and you know, this is going back literally 40 years ago. So the best of my memory, the wire came in within 3 or 4 days, and she wasn't sure where she was going to go to next. And she stayed for another 3 or 4 days before she left the Keys and headed for West Palm Beach.
And did you have any interesting experience with her while she was there staying in Key West?
I did. I had some very long conversations with her. She told me many, many stories about her estranged husband, his illegal activities, and um, some of the things that she had personally been through while she was married to him. Uh, she Now this is interesting because at the time I was just finishing up my rookie year on the department. Later in my career, which extended well over 20 years, I specialized in domestic battery cases. And hindsight being 2020, from the stories that she was telling me, it was clear that she was a battered woman, without a doubt, in my mind.
Yeah, being an officer, but yet you're new on the force. Did you have any suspicions that maybe she was in Key West to help John Paul in his illegal drug smuggling? Because we all know now, of course, what he was doing and how he was, you know, actually financing his racing career with drug smuggling. Did she go into any details about that? Because Key West was a haven, well, all of Florida, but especially Key West, was a haven for drugs to be brought into, especially marijuana back in those days.
I do not believe that she was part of it. She seemed to be anti-drug for the most part. I think she was casual about uh, her marijuana use and the use of marijuana by some members of her family, as she mentioned. But I don't think she wanted anything to do with the smuggling operation that she found herself in the middle of. I do know that she never participated in any of it. And she described to me the events of an arrest where John Paul Jr. was arrested in Louisiana during an offload operation. And apparently that had occurred just a couple of months prior to her being in Key West, because John Paul Jr. had his father apparently bailed him out of jail, and some others that were involved in that particular case. And she was appalled at the whole thing, and she was angry that John Paul Sr. had brought his son into the business, so to speak. I think she was very angry about that.
Well, that's interesting that you brought that up. That's the first time I've heard that, which helps in a timeline of events involving somebody else I know who happened to know John Paul Jr. at the time. So she was still married to Senior at the time when John Paul Jr. got in trouble and got arrested involved with this.
That's correct. In fact, it had happened the way she described it. It had happened, I'm thinking, in the fall of 1980 is when the arrest happened, according to the information that I had from her at the time. And again, this is all 40 years ago, so my memory could play tricks with me, but I remember her distinctly. She empathized with John Paul Jr., and she felt sympathy for him, being that he was going to have a criminal record for the rest of his life, basically due to his father's illegal activity.
And of course, he was a father already, John Paul Jr., with his first daughter when this happened in Louisiana. So that's interesting. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I'm going to cross-reference with my own timeline of events. So did you ever take her down to Duval Street? Because obviously everybody knows when you go to Key West, you have to go to Duval Street.
Yes, of course. She told me that she loved to dance, and at the time I was just learning to dance. And we went to two different clubs. We went to Delmonico's, which was a club right on Duval Street. It was a very famous club at the time. It no longer exists, but a few days later, we went to another club called the Poinciana, and that was a country and western club. And we line danced, and we had a pretty good time. Chalice loved to dance, and she was quite a dancer because when she would start dancing, most everyone on the floor would stop just to watch her. And she was decked out. The movie Urban Cowboy had not been out for very long, and she had all the clothing from that movie. She wore the cowboy hat, the boots, the jeans, and so she was decked out pretty nice, and she definitely loved to dance.
Did she have her fur coat with her?
She did. That particular night that we went to the Poinciana, she did not have it with her, but she would wear it around town. And when I worked the 3 to 11 shift, and as I mentioned earlier, I'd let her use my car, and she would pick me up at the end of my shift, and she would normally be wearing a fur coat. And of course, that caused quite a lot of talk on the police department. I have a rookie officer being picked up by a woman with a fur coat.
Well, it must have been cold then, because this isn't, our normal attire, especially down in the Keys.
Yeah, it was, in December, it can get in the low 40s in the Keys, mid 40s. Being in North Florida now, I would call that cool weather, but once you're acclimatized to the Keys, anything below 50 is cold.
Yeah, this is true. This is very true. I'm a native of South Florida myself. So when she did leave, I know we had this discussion before, because you're a sailor. You had a sailboat at the time, like most people in the Florida Keys. It's either you're a sailor or you're a motorboat person. But you had a sailboat, correct?
I did. I was an avid sailor, and I even competed in some local races with the Key West Yacht Club.
And when she left, she was heading up to see me. Was I mentioned in this conversation with?
Yes, she made several phone calls from my residence, and she was calling her girlfriend in West Palm Beach, and she eventually told me that her girlfriend's name in West Palm Beach was named Lisa, and years later I found out that you're that Lisa.
Yes, I was, and she did come and stay with me too, as a matter of fact. But did you give her a boat part to drop off?
Yes, I had an outboard motor. In fact, it was a Mariner outboard, and the only dealership for Mariners was in West Palm Beach at the time. And when she told me she was going to West Palm Beach, I said, well, drop this off to the marina for me, and it needed some repairs done. And so I loaded the outboard motor in the back of her Audi, and I got a phone call later that day or the following day, I don't recall which, telling me that they had received the outboard in West Palm Beach.
So that guarantees she arrived in West Palm Beach and there was no foul play on that trip.
That's correct. Yeah, she definitely arrived in West Palm, and she delivered the outboard motor for me.
And when you found her website, I think you did a Google search. Is that correct?
I think I was on Facebook, and what I did is I just assumed that she would be on Facebook, and I entered her name both as Chalice Paul and Chalice Barnett, and then the link to the web page came up on Facebook. I think that's how it occurred.
Well, there's a page that I created on Facebook called Chalice Paul Missing Persons. So that's probably the link you got, and then it got you to the website more than likely from there, through Facebook, through social media. But and then you sent me an email, I recall, and that's how we met and we started communicating and comparing notes and timeline and everything. And did you ever discuss her disappearance after you spoke to me with Key West Police Department? Because I wasn't getting anywhere with them over the phone.
Yes, I did. I contacted Donnie Lee, who at the time was the chief of police of the Key West Police Department. I explained to him the situation involving her disappearance and commented to him that no missing persons report had ever been completed in her case. And the reason being is there was not absolutely certainty as to where she disappeared from. So no law enforcement agency was willing to make the report if they couldn't verify that the person had disappeared from their jurisdiction. Donnie Lee, Chief Lee, who just out of reference, I had been his training officer when he first started on the department, referred me to Captain Smith, and Captain Smith and I had come up through the ranks together. He was captain in charge of the investigative bureau, and he agreed that, there should be some kind of a report made, and I in turn gave you the information of both Captain Smith and Chief Donnie Lee.
And I actually made a trip down there to meet with an officer, and I brought my my binder, my 5-inch binder. Of course, I have two now of all my research to date of what I did as far as background and research and phone records, etc. But he took it as an incident report, but it didn't go much further. I did go back down there and I spoke to another sergeant who I'm hoping that I get clearance from Key West Police Department for him to participate in this podcast. We're getting ready to set that up tomorrow. But he was, very useful in the sense that he said that technically the last person to see her alive is where the report should take place, and that should have been in Georgia. So he suggested I go to Georgia, which I did. And I didn't get anywhere there because I found her former roommate, who's also part of this podcast, Ann Fazier, and marched her in with her daughter and myself and my husband into DeKalb County Police Station, hoping that they would take the report, and they had absolutely no interest. In fact, they don't even have a cold case division anymore. It was extremely rude, inconsiderate, and basically escorted us to the elevator to leave the building. I couldn't believe it. And actually, Chalice's sister called in the duration of us being there, because I told her to call just in case, we needed to have verification of a family member. And he had no interest in speaking to her either with the incoming call. So it's been a dead end street as far as getting an active investigation. But do you have any suggestion of what we could do other than what we're doing now, and that's making a podcast to get the word out there to hopefully have other people come forward that might have known her or have information about John Paul Sr. and his whereabouts?
Well, I have some thoughts on the whole issue. From the law enforcement perspective, there has to be, Florida is more friendly to victim rights than many states in the nation. And Florida started that trend in the late 1990s, is when they began paying special attention to victims. See, Chalice is the ultimate victim. And the reason I say that is she's fallen through the cracks of law enforcement agencies all over the nation. Um, I suspect that what has to happen is that the Florida legislature has to take up this subject, because if one person can fall through the cracks like Chalice did, there may be dozens of other people in Florida alone that have fallen through the cracks and were never able to be reported missing. Um, it's a shame and it's a heartbreak that it's not an everyday common occurrence where people go missing and never get reported as missing. But, under Chalice's circumstances of her disappearance, it's one of those cases where, the law enforcement jurisdictions do not want to touch it because they can't be absolutely 100% certain that the victim is missing from their jurisdiction. There should be probably a state clearinghouse for this type of case where any agency in the state of Florida could report, excuse me, as I was saying, any agency in the state of Florida should be able to report someone missing and then go to a clearinghouse where someone somewhere could take a look at the case and at least get them entered as missing and endangered. If the person shows up alive and well and they're missing on their own accord, they can be removed from the system very easily as missing and endangered. But getting them entered into the system, FCIC, NCIC, as missing and endangered is very difficult sometimes.
Well, I must say that I've actually gotten some attention from NamUs, the National Database for Missing Persons. I can view it from my end as far as logging on. I logged in all the information about Chalice, but until law enforcement actually declares her as missing, then that's not going to be viewed to the public eye, unfortunately. And actually, I'm going to try to talk to the woman who actually helped me facilitate get her information into their website, but it's not a public view, unfortunately. This seems to be the issue now. But we know now, I found on newspapers.com by putting in what was going to be her stage name, or she already used it as a stage name, was Barrett instead of Barnett. So it was Barrett-Paul. Chalice Barrett-Paul. I've never put in a hyphen before in all my research on the internet. And bingo, I find a photo that was taken of Chalice. It was a black and white photo by a prominent local photographer here who actually works mostly with real estate companies. And his name was Kim Sargent. And he took the photo. And she was trying to get the part for Guys and Dolls. It was a play. It was a local play that was going to be aired. And so that timeline there was June of 1981. So she went to Key West. She came back to West Palm. And I left to go to New York City to pursue my design career up there, my fashion design career. And she stayed. So we know that she stayed in Palm Beach, or she flew back from Atlanta at that time. But we know for a fact that she was in the West Palm Beach area in June of 1981. But she did return back to Atlanta to get this bit part for Sharky's machine. And that's when she was persuaded by John Paul Sr. to fly back to Florida to meet up with him. And she was never to be seen again after that. So he said personally that she was, he left her in Key West. He told me that personally over the phone. after I went back to do research in Atlanta, to find out about any information I could from her family members or former friends. So that's why this went back to Key West. But once again, Key West said, go back to Georgia. So, it's crossing state lines. So we're very frustrated, myself and her sister, who's been assisting me on this, as to where we can go from here other than advertise it. So I appreciate you coming on today and discussing, what your memories were of that. And of course, once again, everybody that I have interviewed, I said I would like to meet them. You're one of quite a few people, which I'm planning a trip up to northern Florida, and hopefully we can meet then, because I don't anticipate you coming to South Florida anytime soon.
Well, I have no trips planned to South Florida in the immediate future. Tomorrow morning I have a flight into Georgia, but I should be back by tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow evening. I have to be back before sunset because the airport where I keep my airplane at doesn't have landing lights at the runway, so I can't fly in after dark. So I expect to be back between 4 and 5.
Well, I want you to have a safe flight. For all those people out there, if you want to explain what you do now, you're retired from law enforcement, but what are you doing with your plane? Is this for pleasure or for business?
It's actually it was a project that my father and I entered into together. It was a basket case when we purchased it. It was in upstate New York. We brought it down to Florida, and the object of it was to have a project to do together when I retired from the police department. I retired in August of 2003. And unfortunately, 3 days after I retired, my father had a heart attack and never recovered. So I ended up restoring the airplane myself. It took me, not knowing what I was doing, it took me over 2 years to complete the project.
So is it a cargo plane? Are you doing transportation?
No, it's a 4-passenger Piper aircraft that was manufactured in the early 1950s. It's just a pleasure aircraft. It was built in the 1950s as a business plane, but it's really not. It's just a small 4-passenger aircraft that was very economical and fun to fly.
Well, it sounds like a good hobby to have. Just be safe out there. And I appreciate you participating today, and we will be in touch, and we'll certainly give you updates if there's anything else that we find out about John Paul Sr. and his whereabouts. And just stay tuned. And thank you so much, Joe. I want you to stay healthy with this virus going on.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate you having me. No one should have to go through this, what Chalice suffered, and it disturbs me that for years no one seemed to even know that she was missing, and no one should have to go through that. Everyone should have closure, and unfortunately, Chalice's family never had closure.
No, they didn't. Well, thank you so much, Joe, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.